All right then. So, welcome to Lit 115 Darwin, Marx, Freud. So I'm Fabian. Hiya.
I'm John. Hello.
So, and we're conveners and teachers of this course, which is run only by workshops, which is one of the reasons we decided to do these vodcasts for each week. Sort of little provocations to get you thinking about the material that we're about to present.
Yep. So the idea is that we're going to go through things in these podcasts as patiently and as carefully as we can. But if there are ideas that we introduce here that aren't clear, then that's fine. That's what the workshops are for. We can return to any issues that you like at any time. And also, one of the things we're doing here is setting up the questions we're going to be talking about in the podcast. So we're going to end with some of the questions we'll be talking about in class.
Yeah, and even if there's things that you wanted to pick up that we don't mention, just feel free to research and develop them on your own. But hopefully the podcast will be conducive to further readings and thinkings. Right, okay, so our faces are about to disappear, right?
Yes.
How do we do this again? Monitor capture. Okay. And then, right.
Yes.
Beagle.
The Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin I. So as you'll have seen already, there are 3 weeks dedicated to each of the thinkers, and the first week on Darwin concerns his first big book published in 1839, The Voyage of the Beagle. So just to help us be really clear about this and help you know where we're going, we're going to start with a brief summary of what's going to happen in the next 20 minutes or so. So firstly, a really brief context to the Voyage of the Beagle, and this will be brief. This material is very freely available. There's a lot of biographical material about Darwin, so we're not going to labour the point, but just to introduce you to 2 or 3 things that are pertinent to what we're going to be doing in this week's class. Secondly, what is natural history? It sounds like either a very obvious question or a very difficult question, but we'll be offering some hints. We're laughing because there's this weird pop-ups come on the screen about, I can't remember what it, yeah, anyway, ignore that. So next question, what is natural history? It's a really important question for what we're trying to achieve with this week and with the section on Darwin. Connected to this, how does natural history relate to ideology? So that's another term we're going to be defining and encouraging you to think about, ideology. More specifically about this connection between natural history and ideology is the way in which natural history is involved with empire in the 19th century. Then going to offer some more specific aspects of allocated reading for you to think about. We're going to end with the workshop question. So this is your homework, as it were. So there are particular things we're going to ask you to think about, to make notes about, that you can bring to class and feed into our conversations together.
Yeah, and don't worry if there's. Did you say that already, John?
Say it again.
Don't worry if it doesn't necessarily make any sense, or if you have trouble with particular aspects of the material. That's what the workshops are there for, to sort of pore over these questions together. Right.
So, context of the Voyage of the Beagle. This is Darwin as an old man, but the Voyage of the Beagle concerns Darwin as a young man. So in 1831, as a 22-year-old, Darwin set sail to South America as the ship's naturalist aboard the Beagle. And this is, of course, because he's a young man, before he's formed or anything like formed his massive reputation as one of the great leaders of scientific thought. He's actually unsure about what he's going to do with his life. His father and his grandfather were both doctors, and that's something that Darwin's thinking about, it's maybe going into. He's also thinking about whether he might go into the church and become a pastor. We think about Darwin as the founder of evolution, as someone who challenges religious ideas in the 19th century. But at this period of his life, when he's just starting out, he's actually quite a devout man. So he goes off to South America on this geographical trip for 4 years, and this is the research that he conducts as naturalist that is really the foundation for his later work. He begins his evolution notebooks in 1837, so just 2 years after he comes back from the Voyage of the Beagle, and this is the material that feeds into The Origin of Species, one of the most important books in the world, really. And a word on the genre here. So The Voyage of the Beagle is an example of scientific travel writing. There's quite a lot of this going on in the early and to mid-19th century. It's a prominent genre of writing in its own right, and some of the things we're going to be talking about in this class concern this genre, questions of style, questions of what kind of text is the Voyage of the Beagle, what kinds of things can we learn from the Voyage of the Beagle about this larger form of 19th century writing, the scientific travel narrative. So that's the Voyage of the Beagle in a nutshell. So Darwin is a naturalist, and a natural historian would be another way of putting it. So this leads us to this slightly scary, perhaps big question: what is natural history? And I suppose you all have a sense of what natural history evokes. I mean, you might think automatically of David Attenborough, natural history documentaries. In its simplistic form, its most simplistic form, I guess we can think of natural history as knowledge about the world, about the organisms that live there, about the relationship between those organisms. And that's fine as a starting definition. Natural history is knowing about the natural world. But natural history, as the term suggests, is something that itself has a history. So there is also a history of natural history. It doesn't just arrive with David Attenborough, of course, but there's many thousands of years of history that feed in to how we go about knowing the world, the creatures in it, the ecosystems that surround us. And one of the thinkers we'll be drawing off, particularly in this podcast and in this week's class, it is Mary Louise Pratt. You can see the slide of her book, Imperial Eyes, on the screen there. And her book is a really influential text in how we might think critically about natural history. And one of the figures that she draws attention to at the start of this book is Linnaeus, a Swedish natural historian, Carl von Linné, or Linnaeus, two versions of his name, who in the 18th century wrote this book, The System of Nature, which in a way founds the idea of natural history as we come to know it. And this is how Pratt describes Linnaeus's System of Nature, a descriptive system designed to classify all the plants on the earth, known or unknown. So she just refers to plants, but we could refer to all organisms here, and even all stones, all geological formations as well. So this would do as an opening definition of natural history. It's a descriptive system designed to classify all the creatures, the plants, the rock formations on Earth, known or unknown. So classifying everything on Earth. Pratt goes on to make this a little bit more complicated by comparing natural history to other forms of knowledge and forms of culture in the 19th century. So the second quotation on this slide, she makes a connection between natural history and religious conversion. So the 19th century sees a great rise in missionaries trying to convert people in the world to Christianity. And natural history for Mary Louise Pratt works along similar lines to Christian missionaryism, missions, anyway.
No idea.
Yeah, evangelism, I guess. So here's what Pratt says. As Christianity had set in motion a global labour of religious conversion that assorted itself at every other point of contact with other societies, so natural history set in motion a secular global labour. So the key term to emphasise there is that natural history is a global labour. For sure, you can do it in your back garden, but in the 18th and 19th century, it's conceived as a globalised project. It's not enough just to know what's on your own back door. You need to know everything in the world. So in that sense, it has an impetus similar to Christian missionaryism of leaving the homeland and going out into the world to explore and to learn and to know. Is natural history ideological? If so, does this mean it's not true? This, I think, is the main aspect of this week's class. And to help you get into this, a quotation from Terry Eagleton. If you've not come across him before, he's a very influential literary theorist. And he writes, ideology has to do with legitimating the power of a dominant social group or class. So ideology is to do with politics, it's to do with power, it's to do with power relations, it's to do with exerting power over those who have been disempowered. So ideology is to do with class politics, as we'll talk about with Marx, as we'll talk about in a second. It's to do with empire, to do with race, to do with globalization. And the supposition of this week's class is that natural history is also to do with ideology, that there is a connection between knowing the world and the creatures in it and the politics that are practiced in the world. I'll explain a little bit more about how that works in a second with regard to empire, but just to foreground a big, difficult question here. If natural history is ideological, that is to say, if it's formed through politics, through ideas about politics and power relations, does this mean it's not true? I don't know the answer to that, really. Do you know the answer to that?
No, I don't, but maybe we can find the answer together.
Yeah, so bear that in mind. What is the relationship between the social cultural construction of ideas about nature and just the truth of the world, the material facts of the creatures in it? So keep this question in mind: is natural history ideological? And let it bubble under the surface. What we can say for certain is that there's a close relationship between natural history and empire. Again, I'm drawing on Mary Louise Pratt here. The first quotation here emphasised the way in which natural history is a way of knowing the world with a particular cultural location, and this cultural location is in opposition or in tension with other cultures. So natural history comes from Europe and it's exported in the same way that Christianity was to other cultures who have, for sure, their own ways of understanding the natural world, their own natural history. So Pratt writes, one by one, the planet's life forms were to be drawn out of the tangled threads of their life surroundings and rewoven into European-based patterns of global unity and order. So natural history is significant for the way it serves empire. One way of giving examples of this is to think about naming. So natural history, when it identifies supposedly new species, gives them names, and this is in a sense the birth of the species. But to look at it another way, those species have also exist in relation to indigenous cultures, for example. So the act of natural history is an act of removing an organism from its significance in one culture and placing it into European culture. So this is one of the ways in which global unity and order illustrates natural history and empire working together. There are also some practical ways in which natural history and empire work together, as in the second quotation here from Pratt, that most naturalists were seen as handmaidens to Europe's expansive commercial aspirations. Practically speaking, in exchange for free rides with trading companies and so forth, they produced commercially exploitable knowledge. So natural history was useful. Empire was driven not just by Christianity, but perhaps even more notably by capital. Natural historians were particularly useful in working out the details of plantation culture, for example, in thinking about what species, animal or vegetable, could be useful and to businesses and to commerce in the European world. And also natural historians were often the first people to set foot in supposedly undiscovered lands. And in that sense, they work as the advance party of the kind of military and commercial operations that follow. And you'll get from reading Darwin's The Voyage of the Beagle that it is clearly a text concerned with empire, that he's writing about other territories than Britain and looking at them in a very imperialist way. Just want to give one example from a different writer of some of the ways in which empire emerges in natural history writing. So the example I've got on the screen here is from Charles Waterton, who earlier in the 19th century, around about the 1820s, wrote Wanderings in South America. So he's concerned with the same region that Darwin is in The Voyage of the Beagle. And Waterton is a romantic figure in the sense that his writing is very influenced by romanticism. He's rather an eccentric figure, and you can visit his house actually in Wakefield in West Yorkshire, not far from Sheffield. Anyway, this is an example from his text Wanderings in South America that exemplifies what Mary Louise Pratt calls the monarch-of-all-I-survey trope. So that's Pratt's term for a particular narrative device that expresses the explorer and natural historian's sense of their own power over the land they're visiting. I'll read this longest passage out and make a couple of observations about it, but I'll leave you to do the really detailed work of thinking about how ideas of power are folded into this description of the natural world. So Waterton writes, "At the base of this hill stretches an immense plain, which appears to the eye on this elevated spot as level as a bowling green. The mountains on the other side are piled one upon the other in romantic forms, and gradually retire till they are indiscernible from the clouds in which they are involved. To the south-southwest, this far-extending plain is lost in the horizon. The trees on it, which look like islands on the ocean, add greatly to the beauty of the landscape, while the rivulet's course is marked out by the ator trees which follow its meanders. Not being able to pursue the direct course from hence to the next Indian habitation on account of the floods of water which fall at this time of year, you take a circuit westerly along the mountain's foot. At last, a large and deep creek stops your progress. It's wide and rapid, and its banks very steep. There is neither curial nor canoe, nor purple heart tree in the neighbourhood to make a woodskin to carry you over, so that you are obliged to swim across, and by the time you've formed a kind of raft composed of boughs of trees and coarse grass to ferry over your luggage, the day will be too far spent to think of proceedings. You may be very cautious before you venture to swim across this creek, for the alligators are numerous and near 20 feet long." So this passage obviously concerns the beauty of the landscape. This is one way in which Waterton is fitting in with the romantic writing of the time. But it also concerns power. And if you think about the topography of Waterton's imagination here, he is in an elevated position looking down on the landscape. And because he's elevated above it, he's in an empowered relationship over it. He can see everything beneath him. So this, in a sense, is laying out the land as a map. So the map as a tool for colonial expansion. So this is one way that we can see subtly in this text, there's an imperial agenda going on. Also, I'll draw your attention in the last paragraph from this slide to the use of the second person. You must be very cautious, to carry you over. So it situates the reader in the place of the text as if you, the reader, are joining Waterton in his adventures. So you could say that it situates the reader or even interpolates the reader in this world. So it's presuming that everyone reading this has the same relationship to the landscape that he does. So he's speaking not just for himself, but almost for a whole country that, in a sense, he's carrying with him in the rhetoric of this piece.
Yeah, so these are just some things to bear in mind while reading the text and following on very much from what John has just said. So one of the things to bear in mind is this question of perspective, and that last quotation by Waterton, I think, exemplifies that question of perspective, of being elevated and empowered to look at the landscape unfolding around him. And John also mentions that it's about laying out the landscape as map. There is a French theorist called Michel de Certeau, that's a sort of second quotation there, or bits of quotation on the slide from the practice of everyday life, where he's very much occupied with maps and with the relationships between maps and what knowledge that they form about the world. And he calls maps totalizing observations, and also refers to them as an ecstasy, as forming an ecstasy of knowledge. And he also talks about them as being a neurotics of knowledge. Actually, his book, or that particular chapter, starts out with him describing New York from the top of the Empire State Building. So you've got the same perspective as Waterton there on his hill, looking at the landscape below him. So this kind of knowledge that is being formed about the world, what kind of politics does that bring with it? If the entire world is knowable, what happens to, say, magic, what happens to the occult? Is that totally banished from this kind of Enlightenment thinking? And is this kind of process of observing neutral? Well, as like John said before, is very much not neutral, but it carries with it all sorts of imperial and violent politics, which is about putting things in a particular type of order which fits with how we, e.g., we over here, tend to think about the other, and the other is always sort of configured as an object in that kind of system. The object of our gaze, but also the object of, well, I guess there's a sort of, the violence of the gaze comes into play here as well as the violence of the letter, which is another thing that John mentioned about the naming systems. And there are examples in the Voyage of the Beagle where you can think about those kind of procedures, these violent procedures of language and of naming. Yeah. So I guess one of the questions to think about is, what does it mean to carry a chain of chronometrical measurements around the globe? And you might want to think about that in relation to this vodcast and come up with examples from the Voyage of the Beagle. You can pick up some moments where, for example, the conduct of Darwin and his posse is completely invisible to them, whereas the other becomes this object to be investigated with a supposedly neutral gaze. Right. Yeah, I mean, so that's proceeding on from the previous slide, really. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world, is a sort of example of the othering of fellow creatures, as Darwin calls them, we who live together on this planet together, but there's a sort of hierarchy and power relations here at work. There's also, I guess, one of the other questions that I've become quite interested about, and that is something that we talk about in relation to Darwin as well, is this idea of what sort of value a life has. And there are moments when there is this assignation of value to the lives that are being observed in the Voyage of the Beagle. The one example that I picked out and put on the slide is this idea of useless forests, and that, as I said, very much will return to that question for Marx, where for capitalism to work, all forms of life have to be put to work, and the sort of perniciousness of assigning value to any type of life form. What does it mean to describe someone or something as useless? The final point really that I want to mention is the that last quotation on the slide, our care in washing ourselves. This idea that that we Europeans, even though that we has also been severely shattered over the summer, but this idea that there's a we here, a community where there's a care about not smelling. There's a sort of abstract citizenship at work, but the other, and again, maybe that's one thing to pay attention to when you're reading the extracts from the Voyage of the Beagle. See how the other is being described, and there's this notion of abjection, which is taken from a French psychoanalyst, Julia Kristeva, talking about abjection as that which we'd like to expel from our bodies and deny. It's about sort of closing up the body to sort of make it tidy and clean, and maybe that's another thing to think about in relation to empire, politics, borders, property, hierarchy, that kind of thing. Well, okay. So we're just going to end this vodcast with a few questions that you might want to think about and develop further, though, as I said, none of this is prescriptive, so feel free to also bring along material that struck you, that we didn't mention. But yeah, what we'd like you to do is to choose 2 or 3 brief extracts in which the representation of nature appears ideological.
Yeah, so give it a go. Yes, secondly, find a passage in which we're made aware of the narrator. So natural history, if that's the process of knowing about the world, what do we know about Darwin's narrative persona? Look for moments when Darwin, in a sense, becomes a character in his own narration. Are there moments when you can get a sense of the narrative voice?
Yeah, and then, I mean, I guess just to reiterate what we've already said, you can prepare some thoughts on any other aspect of the text and or the vodcast that interested you. And that's pretty much it for this first vodcast. So thanks very much for listening. We did the other take before, which was awful.
Yeah,
I think this was
this is
hopefully
better.
much better.
Yeah, but we do welcome your feedback.
Exactly.
So, you know, and if there's stuff that you want us to cover in the podcast in future weeks, you know, on the topic, you know, not it's not like a phone in on 5 Live or something. So, but do let us know if there's particular bits that you want us to go over. Again, it's going to be helpful and for your work, maybe particularly when you get close to assessments later on.
All right, okay then. Well, thanks very much, and we'll see yous, you know, next week or whenever. Right. Bye.
Bye.